Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the first part of our WCIS webinar series on gender and diversity. This is Victoria Dimitriades, and I am joined today by Lisa Forbes as well. We are both serving as moderators for tonight's presentation. As you all know, this year has been filled with both personal and professional challenges, which have altered how we work and thrive for the foreseeable future. Our speaker this evening was originally scheduled to speak at our annual meeting in April, and we didn't want to miss the opportunity to address this timely topic by waiting until the next time we will be able to be together. Also, this webinar series helps us to dovetail into the formation of the newest CIS committee, the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which will be formally introduced in the next few months. The first part of this series today is a general overview on why it's important to address the issue of gender disparity and how we can affect change. Our speaker tonight is Stephanie F. Donner, who is the former Chief Legal Counsel for former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper. Stephanie was also the Chief Legal and People Officer for Galvanize, a technology education company. Her career has been dedicated to advancing policy and impactful change in key areas such as access to STEM education, the future of work and technology reforms, and voting access. She empowers women to act within existing societal frameworks in order to break down barriers that impede progress. Her recently published book, When Women Vote, highlights the challenges Americans, particularly women, face in the current voting process and the amazing things that can happen with election and voting reform. When Women Vote makes the case for further voting reform to increase voter turnout among women and other disenfranchised groups in order to effect change. She recently expanded her work on this project as she has joined her co-author at the National Vote at Home Institute, where they have launched the Equality Initiative, an expansive election reform to advance equality for women. Tonight's talk will highlight historical parallels to changing policy infrastructure and affecting impactful change in healthcare, in career advancement, and to ultimately providing an environment where creative and innovative change can take place. She'll also give examples of how empowering women with tools and access to resources can influence shifts in culture and policy advancement. During this talk, we're going to hold all questions until the end. Feel free to ask them in the chat box or the Q&A box to your left, and then the moderators will come back and discuss these questions with Stephanie at the end. And with that, I turn the platform over to you, Stephanie.
Well, thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here. I don't normally get to talk to a group of physicians, so I'm a little nervous and feel a little bit inadequate already. So go easy on me, please. But I appreciate being here, and the topic that we're discussing tonight is ever more prevalent and newsworthy. My co-author, and we'll talk a little bit about that, she's on every cable news television show these days talking about ballots and election reform. And it has been quite a busy time for us, considering that we undertook this effort in 2018, really not knowing that we would be in a global pandemic, and voting and election would actually become center stage as opposed to just the election itself. So with that, we started this effort, and as many of you well know, we are celebrating this year the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And actually in Colorado, where I live, it is the 125th year following a victory at the polls in 1893. And this was no small achievement. So in researching and writing my book, When Women Vote, which we will discuss in greater detail in a bit, I learned some things about this history that I was not aware of. Frankly, some things that stunned me. So in states like Wyoming and Utah, women won, or rather achieved, the right to vote through legislative action. But in Colorado, the suffragists needed the support of male voters to secure the right to vote. And they had to convince a majority of men in the state that they should have the same rights. So think about that for a second. The only way that women could get the right to vote is if men granted it to them. And that was no small feat. And as one story goes, one of the reasons the men did not want the women to vote is because they would not be home to make dinner. And that's true. So, how did they respond? The women developed cookbooks and they sold campaign materials inside the cookbooks so that their fellow women would have materials to use to convince their husbands while they were making dinner, and also to raise money for the movement. And these were literally recipes for subversion. And you can read all about this. It's one of the most fascinating things about the women's suffrage movement. But it's truly proof that even then, women were savvy marketers. Our suffragist sisters had to think and act within the parameters of society and in order to change them. Women persevered on their own terms, and Western women were often on the frontier of history. The victory in 1893 made Colorado the first state in the Union to grant women the right to vote through popular referendum. And it happened over a quarter of a century before the national women's suffrage in 1920. So hit pause here for a second. You're probably wondering, why are we talking so much about Colorado? Well, we will come back, in addition to the fact that it's where I am, we'll come back to this because this is actually really critical to the discussion that we're having. So all of you are here tonight, and you've enjoyed much success because of the suffrage of those who have come before, but also ostensibly because you had help, not just from your fellow female sisters, but your grandmothers, your grandfathers, and great-grandfathers, and colleagues, and male colleagues too. And one of my favorites, people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, of course, I'm an attorney, so I have a proclivity towards fantastic judges. But RBG fought for equality on the basis of sex, alongside her supportive husband, who took on many domestic responsibilities so that she could fight for a movement for women. And that required a ton of work, a ton of proverbial, campaign materials going inside a ton of cookbooks in many, many different ways. And while we do not have exactly the same challenges that those women had in 1893 and after, we have many new and different challenges, and we need to activate and leverage the sisterhood and brotherhood to continue to make progress for our daughters, for our sons, for our sisters and our brothers, and for all of our colleagues and all of you here tonight. Like RBG, she recognized that while her life was made possible because of community, once she got there, there was great work to be done. So here are just some of the challenges. As of the printing of this book, When Women Vote, 80% of elected officials at every level were men. Women made up only 27% of board seats in S&P companies. Men outnumber women as leaders in companies by 4 times. Women-founded companies in the US got just 2.8% of all venture capital funding in 2019. And while that may seem insubstantial, it is actually quite a bit up from 2018. Women as a whole make 20% less than men. And breaking it down, we calculate that white women as a whole make 78 cents on the dollar compared with white males. Hispanic women make 53.5 cents, and African American women make just a little bit more than that at 63 cents on the dollar compared with white women. And Justice Ginsburg, may she rest in peace, would not be proud to learn that researchers are predicting that it will be easier to go to the moon again than to close the gender parity gap in the legal profession. Now, let's talk about STEM. There are only 28% of women in STEM fields as opposed to 72% of men. And while women are underrepresented in STEM fields, both in the college and the job market, there are even fewer women of color. Out of all female doctorate graduates in the fields of science and engineering, 86% are white or Asian, fewer than 4% are Latinas, and less than 3% are African American. The same can be observed in the job market as well. Only 1 out of 20 employed scientists and engineers are Black, women, and Latinas. Statistics show that women in STEM jobs are paid an average of 89 cents per each dollar that men in STEM make. In some fields, the wage gap is even larger. For example, female chemists earn 30% less than male chemists. And of course, women in STEM leave at massively faster rates than men. Now, you physicians are doing just a little bit better than everyone that we just talked about. The numbers are still not great, but they are better. Victoria was kind enough to provide me some data from 2017 as I was in preparation of this talk. And I suspect these numbers are not that far off from today, because as much as there are more women entering your field, men are increasingly entering and staying as well. So we don't typically see that much of a difference in these numbers. So across all specialties, males make up about 64.8% and women about 35.2%. For some specialties, there's more disparate. From the information that I got from Victoria, 61.6% of men make up the allergy immunology field, while there's only 38.4% of women. And then, of course, there are certain fields in medicine, and you all are more well aware than I am. I was stunned a little bit by general surgery, gastroenterology, and anesthesiology, so I chose to focus on that. But that shows almost an 80-20 ratio. And then the one field that is flipped and reversed, which we have there on the bottom, is pediatrics, which is about 63% women to 36% men. This issue is not new. In writing this book, I found this quote from Lucy Stone at Seneca Falls in 1848. She said, "We want rights. The flower merchant, the house builder, and the postman charge us no less on account of our sex. But when we endeavor to earn money to pay all of these, then indeed we find the difference." It's amazing to think that in kicking off the women's suffrage movement in 1848, Miss Lucy Stone made that statement. So we wrote When Women Vote to advocate for changing the infrastructure that created the bias that we've just talked about. These disparate impacts and the number of women representation at all levels in business, nonprofit, everywhere is the numbers don't lie. And so in thinking through how do we, like the suffragists that came before us, look and act within the parameters of society in order to change it. And so just as our suffragist sisters did, we advocate for working within existing parameters that created the bias in order to change it. And it is the infrastructure that we see that has created much of that. So in this case, we looked at how do you get more women from the ballot to the boardroom and get policies that can actually focus on issues such as pay equity, healthcare, childcare. What is the mechanism that we can do to do it? Because in our estimation, the strategies of changing the women and focusing on the women aren't working. Because if you look, our numbers are still abysmal. And so we have to look at other ways to truly look within what our system is and why it was created to change it. And we think, my co-author and I, election reform, as sexy as that sounds, is the path forward.
Many of the systems in our society, whether it's voting, education, healthcare, climate, were set up with bias. They were set up to exclude people from participating. And sometimes you have to look at the infrastructure that created the bias in order to change it.
I think in general, women always provide a different perspective and a unique perspective, and I feel it's important for women to be a part of the process.
While we did see an increase in women running for office and women getting elected, we are still at abysmal numbers. I mean, only 26% of Congress is women. And that is astonishing considering that 51% of the population are women.
If we want to make sure that women get elected, the strategies that we're using right now that focus on making the women better aren't working. You know, we now rank 85th in the world for women's representation.
The way we vote, the fact that it's easier to get an AR-15 than it is to vote for President of the United States of America means something has to change.
The premise that we've laid out is when more women engage more directly in our democracy, we will start to see representation numbers change.
We found that the states that had implemented the voting reform that Amber and I worked on in 2013 in Colorado are also the states with the highest women's representation.
If you want better streets, better roads,
The school system, I think really pretty much everything gets down to that opportunity to really participate.
It completely changes those dynamics where ultimately decisions are made.
So the premise is that when there are more women, not just elected, but in boardrooms, in leadership positions, represented as a 50-50 representation of any field, then you get better policies and better decisions. And we chose to focus on election reform because, as you will see, the states that have done that are the states with the highest women's representation. There are also the states that have policies that focus on healthcare, education, and the environment. And this is not an issue that is actually a political issue. So the history of women's suffrage in the United States is complicated, to say the least, and continues to be complicated hundreds of years after that first national election in 1789. The election process still operates in an antiquated way with very, very few changes. There's so many barriers: restrictive voter registration and deadlines, or inconvenient and non-existing voting options. We're seeing this play out in the news every single day right now. The more barriers there are to vote, the harder it is for women to vote, especially those who are in school, have children, or are holding multiple jobs. It's difficult to find affordable childcare or to take the time required to get to the polls. This is so for women. This is also so for men. Even the careers and industries dominated by women, such as teaching, nursing, retail, hospitality, service, and being a mom, are the very ones with the types of schedules that do not allow personal time off for hours to stand in line or travel to vote on one set day. And the casualty of this is you have fewer women in representative women. Women of color are especially impacted, as even higher numbers of these women work in community and social service occupations, healthcare, food service, and personal care. Americans who want to vote are conditioned to show up at a designated polling place, wait in long lines, and finally cast a ballot. There is a massively increased number of voter turnout right now. We are seeing this. I was just checking the lines in every state across the United States. There are many, 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 many people waiting in lines for all the way up to 8 hours. This inconvenience is actually the best case scenario. The worst case scenario includes voters who have been cleared from voting rolls, who have gone to the wrong polling place, or who have completely missed the registration deadline to begin with. A 2016 survey of unregistered voters found that most had never even been asked if they wanted to register. And the Census Bureau estimates that at least 1/3 of eligible voting age citizens remain unregistered. Even when a citizen takes the time to register, the rules surrounding registration cutoff dates are confusing and not designed to put voters first. Consider the trending conversation around making Election Day a national holiday. If a national holiday is needed in order to help more people vote, isn't every single person who works disenfranchised? Eligibility to vote and our voting system is not an issue painted red or blue or political at all. New York and Connecticut require voters to provide an excuse in order to receive a ballot early, as do Texas and Mississippi. These arbitrary barriers prevent full participation in our democracy. Inconvenient voting options limits turnout. The 2016 presidential election and the 2018 midterm election saw a record number of voters and turnout, but they are still only accounted for 61% and 50% of eligible voters, respectively. And 2018 saw the highest turnout for a midterm in 100 years. That's our theme tonight, 100 years. Again, everything that is old is new again. But when it is all said and done, we are not really a red or a blue country. We are rather a no-vote country. Most states make it difficult to vote because that is the infrastructure and the system that we set up for ourselves. We are an opt-in rather than an opt-out system of voting. And the casualty of that is when there's lower voter turnout, less women find themselves in representative positions, and our policies are impacted as a result. And while we have made indelible progress as a nation to advance women and to engage voters, there is a lot more that we need to do. Solutions that we advocate for in our book include expanding voting at home options, early voting, automated and same-day registration, primary reform, and nonpartisan redistricting. It is no coincidence that the top 4 states with the highest number of women representatives, Nevada, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, have many of the voting-friendly laws that we advocate for in When Women Vote. Modern registration policies, expanded early voting, convenient opportunities to vote on or before Election Day, open primaries, and fair redistricting. It is a direct correlation that those states that have implemented many of these reforms have the highest number of women representatives. Nevada has a 50-50 split, actually it's a majority women, and they have many of these reforms. Now, remember when we hit the pause button and we were talking earlier about Colorado? Okay, here's where we get to the point. Those same states were the states that led the way in the women's suffrage movement, beginning in 1869. So Colorado elected its first 3 women to the Colorado General Assembly in 1894, the year after Colorado suffragists achieved the right to vote. So here you can see these are the states that led the way on suffrage, and you can see the map going that way. Now, why is this important? Well, when more women are at the table or in the voting booth, other improvements occur. Here's the interesting thing. You see the map here? This is the current states that have done voting at home, mail ballots. It's the same shading. These are also the states that have done same-day registration or automatic registration. So if you compare the maps and overlay the map of suffrage with these election reforms, you see a pattern. When more women are at the table or in the voting booth, more advancements occur. Women legislators, here's the important part, sponsor more bills, pass more laws, and send their districts more money. Men, studies have shown, are more likely to propose bills in agriculture, energy, and defense. Multiple papers written on this, including our book. Women are more likely to sponsor bills in such areas as health, education, and individual rights. Take the 2019 Nevada legislative session as an example. Nevada is the only state with a majority of women in the state legislature and a state that has implemented many of the reforms that we advocate for. Women introduced bills such as adding an Equal Rights Amendment to the state constitution, banning child marriage, creating a review panel to research maternal mortality, and supporting the mental health of children. Once again, changing the way we vote creates more opportunities for diversity, and when there is more diversity at the table, it brings these types of issues to the forefront of public disclosure. Of public discourse. Similar trend in Colorado. When Colorado implemented its voting reforms, it had a similar outcome. Of all the states, Colorado has the second highest number of women in its state legislature. And in 2019, Colorado women sponsored legislation to address pay equity, improve retirement savings, provide a paid family leave, among other women-centric policies. The Equal Pay for Equal Work Act was signed into law here in June 2019. That same legislative session yielded a law funding full-day kindergarten and another to make sexual harassment complaints against elected officials part of a public record, and a bill to create a 12-week paid family leave insurance program did not pass but became a feasibility study. And you are seeing this across the country in all places where we are reaching more parity for women in representative positions. For our book, we interviewed Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who's been in the news quite a bit lately. She is a Democrat. She said, "We often say that you can't be what you can't see. But the truth is, you have to be what you can't see right now." She said, "I think a lot of times women leadership is exactly that, being what you are not seeing." The other Secretary of State that we interviewed for our book is Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman, a Republican. Both of these women, different parties, led on election reform. They are also leading the country right now in administering a fair, equitable, and accessible election. And Kim Wyman, what did she say? "If we want to see more women in elected office, in the boardroom, and in leadership positions in all fields, particularly STEM, we are going to have to overcome some pretty simple things. But we are going to have to do it together. And frankly, it's going to have to be other women and men that help, because that's kind of what it takes." A sisterhood. This is me and my sister who's on this call tonight when we were little. But it was her and I together supporting one another, but everyone else in our careers and otherwise who has identified that when you take part in the discourse and you do this together, change can actually be at the forefront. But it's not just a sisterhood. It's together with all of our brothers, fathers, and grandfathers. And there's my sister and I with our brother, who now has 2 young girls of his own and who is so grateful every day that all of us are paving the way for parity. So just as our suffragist sisters did 100 years ago, let's honor what women and men fought for so bravely 100 years ago. And the advice, if it wasn't obvious from our maps earlier, is simple. Look west. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to address you tonight and to share with you some of the infrastructure changes that I'm working on in this country to affect change. And I think that if all the professions, physicians are actually doing a good job of coming up with a number of different strategies that actually allow women to stay in the workforce. And I hope that this talk will inspire all of you to continue to think about how we can change the infrastructure that has created much of the bias in order to change it.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was amazing. And the treats and surprises at the end. So everybody can see that I am clearly cuter when I was younger than I am now.
I haven't seen a question in the chat box, so I'm going to lead off the discussion, and I'm going to say, or ask that for that matter. You highlighted a Democrat and a Republican that both spoke about the need to do this together. And something that I always say about what we do in immunology and rare disease is this is a team sport, and you can't do it without everybody working together. So what kinds of strategies do you have you learned along the way in your expertise to garner that support from someone across the table that might not be like-minded, but needs to get behind the movement so we can affect change? Not only just in your research from the book, but you've had the opportunity to sit in many boardrooms full of men where you have to affect change. And I think that your expertise and your experience and some pearls would be well accepted in this group. So what do you think about that?
Thanks, Lisa. We talk about this in part 3 of the book. Part 3 of the book is really about the benefits of having the diversity of thought at the table. And one of the things that both Secretaries Wyman and Benson address in the book is exactly this, that appealing to the common interests that we're all trying to seek and figuring out where the points of agreement are is really an excellent strategy in moving towards what does good look like. And I think that that's what I try to do, whether it's my time as being general counsel and, in a boardroom, or my time, in politics, is really to say it's not actually possible that we don't all agree on some things. So starting with the premise of what you do agree on and working from there is the best thing. I'd say the only other thing that I have learned is that sometimes the part of the best way to be persuasive is to listen. And our dad used to say, you don't learn anything when you're talking. And so that is sometimes a strategy that is very effective when trying to figure out where your common points of interest are.
Okay, I think Lisa stepped out for a moment. I actually put a question in the chat box. My question was, a lot of us are in university settings at this point. So do you have suggestions for us on how we can bring this back to our university setting, and kind of how do we begin? How would we start something that can help affect us later on, get us more visible? Obviously, like you said, the more of us in leadership positions, the better it is for people who aren't, and being a good example, right? How would you suggest starting that?
Well, I'm very this is like candy to me, because I think university particularly on election reform and voting, which is what my book's mostly focused about in order to bring parity. I would say that university settings are huge places where we can inspire people to understand that voting matters and participation matters. That is, I would love it. We have a playbook at the end of our book, and one of the things we talk about is civics education, and how do we teach students all the way from kinder to college, that their voice and their vote and their participation matters. And so I think that each university setting is different in terms of how you start things and how you can see them through. But I think inspiring a whole generation to participate is, it's like a dream come true. I think there was another comment in there. I don't know where it is, but I can find it. Let's see. I have fantastic male mentors who have supported me. However, I wonder how we can engage men more on the issues related to gender diversity and parity. I too, Megan, have had many. I've only almost had male mentors. Certainly, growing up in the practice of law and in politics, it is not. And then being in technology companies, it is not fraught with many women and many women leaders. I think that's part of why I tried to include the notion that it's for our brothers and our sisters, our male colleagues, and then also at the end, a brotherhood. Because like suffrage, especially the example I gave about Colorado, we cannot do this without help and support from our male colleagues. I know at least here in Colorado, I'm a little biased, but the Colorado Women's Chamber does an incredible job of ensuring that men participate in almost all of the events around women in business. I personally don't ever have my own personal kitchen cabinet or anything without male influence, because diversity of thought is really what it's about. And we're talking about getting parity, because in so many places women aren't even represented, but it really is about parity and diversity of thought. And so I think that if you're inspired to have a women's group, or you attend women's groups, or you are advocating for other women, including men, is really the only solution to having a good buy-in and a lasting solution. So we talk a lot about that in our book also, that election reform is really makes it better for the women, but makes it better for everybody. And I think that's an important thing. And I agree with you. Would never be where I am if it weren't for the amazing men, including my dad, and mentors.
There's a question that came through, I think, through the Q&A, and the question from Virginia Madla was, would older qualified women be more marketable in businesses or the boardroom, for instance?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think that qualifications are, really have nothing to do with age necessarily. I think it depends on what is the board opportunity, or what's the business opportunity, as to whether or not you fit those qualifications or don't. I hope that we are moving to a place in this country that whether you are older, midlife, childbearing, not, if you are qualified, that you have a seat at the table. I'm not sure if that answers the question, and if it doesn't, I'm happy to take the question in another way to provide clarity.
I think sometimes, at least in our field, there is a discussion regarding how there are fewer women the longer you are within a career. So we have a lot more assistant professors than we have associate professors, than we have full professors. So I guess, trying to come back, I'm guessing it's trying to come back to that topic of we need more female mentors and examples that we can kind of follow, and perhaps we can market them as great examples.
Well, I think that goes back to the quote that we said from Jocelyn Benson in the talk just now, which is, you can't be what you can't see, but sometimes you have to. And I would say in STEM fields in particular, and we saw this in our research, that women leave at a higher rate. And I mentioned that in the earlier part of the presentation. And so encouraging people to stay so that they can pave the way and be those mentors, I think is critical.
Stephanie, Rebecca Marsh says, thank you for the seminar. I can remember several quote unquote small but super important encouragements in education and training from mentors that led to having the confidence to pursue a career in medicine and take on leadership roles. I wondered if you could comment on the small everyday actions efforts from your early career that you found most helpful to you, and what do you make sure you say to your younger colleagues that you now find yourself mentoring?
Oh, goodness. Sometimes I think it was also the negative things that gave me the fire in the belly to keep going. But positive things from my career are the opportunity to advance. Maybe those are a little bit bigger, but every small little opportunity that I had to, whether it was when I was at a law firm to assume a leadership position on a committee, or the opportunity to take a job or to take on a new project that would help, But I also I was encouraged to do things like join women's groups, join when I was more heavily focused in my legal career. I joined the Women's Bar Association. I joined the Women's Chamber. I found small groups that I could form networks of other women that could help support me. And I would say today, those women and my networks in those spaces are some of the strongest advocates for me, support system that I have needed. And so when I say to younger colleagues, first of all, don't second guess yourself. If you want something, do it, go for it. Surround yourself with mentors and colleagues that will help advocate for you. And also join, and oh my God, I just saw the next question come in. It's such a good one. Hold on, I got distracted. Join those groups, and that's what I tell them all the time. I also tell them to always reach out. I never turn down a coffee. In this day and age, it's a webinar, but I always am happy to role play if you're interviewing for a job, or help you think through some people that I may know or ways to help. But to have that system that you can call on has been critical for me. I would never be where I am today. I would never have been inspired to write this book if it weren't for all those amazing women in my life.
Stephanie, I'm going to read the question, but you've already read it. How do you recommend physicians becoming more politically active, especially as science and medicine are being politicized in extremely dangerous ways, with the lack of counterpoints to false narratives, but balancing the need to have all patients feel welcome in our care, and knowing that social media is generally very public?
I think it's a fine line, and I don't know that it's really my recommendation. I don't know is really to become politically active, because that often requires you to choose sides, and I don't know. I think that's a fine line when you're trying to welcome all patients in your care. But what I do know is that there are people who I think election reform is critical, because you get way more of a diversity of thought. And it truly does change the infrastructure of who is making those decisions. And that's why I was inspired to write a book. I mean, just more like the idea of more women running and more women getting elected, that doesn't really work. And you saw that in the short video that we played. And so the idea is if you really want to change policies, getting involved with things that really change elections and how people are selected, but then also keeping track of that, making yourselves available to testify on bills, getting involved with nonpartisan groups that are supportive of the causes that you support, that are involved in policy discussions. I mean, there's a difference between being involved heavily in policy and being involved in politics. And if you're involved in politics, it's, are you donating to campaigns? You can do that. It's public information. But a more a potentially safer but equally as impactful way is to find those nonpartisan organizations that are truly supporting. Maybe they're supporting candidates, or maybe they're supporting causes that are important to you. And I say particularly for women, the more you can do it as a unit, as a group, the more impactful that you are. And that's what I've found also. And there's a thread in our book. It starts out with a group of women who had something called the Tuesday Club. And you'll have to read the book to figure out how I came to find out about the Tuesday Club. But it's a thread to say, and all the women we interviewed for our book across the way, they all had women's groups. They all had groups that they either organized with or bounced ideas off of. I mean, historically, that's how the women's suffrage movement even started. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met at a tea party, and not the kind of tea parties that we talk about right now. They met sipping tea in upstate New York and launched the women's suffrage movement. So I think there's a lot of power in women coming together. And I think you're right that science and medicine are politicized in incredibly dangerous ways. And I think that election reform and getting more people out to vote and more parity in who's our representatives will help. But I also think physicians making themselves available to get accurate information out and aligning yourselves with nonpartisan organizations that are committed to accurate information. And that may protect you a little bit on social media as well from being overly political, but from being on the right side of policy.
So
On to the mentor. Yeah.
sorry, I was trying to see if there was any more in the chat. I don't see that Morgan has anything else coming in. I did want to mention that tonight Stephanie has donated copies of her book to us and this group. And for the first 20 people who can send an email with their name and contact information, that is a mailing address, we will send you a copy of this book. The email is I will put it in the chat box. It is info@clinimsoft.org, and I will put it in the chat right now. So whoever gets that into us will get a mailed copy of this book, just as a yay. And with that, I think we have completed all of the questions. I'm sorry, Lisa was having a little bit of trouble. Ooh, I do see. Nope, no more. Lisa was having a little internet trouble, so we're sorry that she got kicked off. I will.
Do we have one more question?
Yes, you have one?
No, I was going to say, I thought there was maybe one more question coming in. I couldn't. Oh, I see. It's just an address.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Morgan. Morgan put in the email address to send the information to. And make sure you do a street address and a state and zip code for us too. So with that, thank you so much, Stephanie. This was really, really informative. I truly appreciate you joining us tonight and helping us learn more about this. Please feel free to make some finishing comments, and then we'll let you go because I know you have another meeting coming up too.
I do. I'm giving another talk tonight, if you can believe it. It's so easy now that one of the benefits of COVID is that I can sit here in my home office and talk to people all over the world about election reform. But I do want to say that back to the question about politics and getting engaged, we bend over backwards in our book to be nonpartisan. And even though I have personally a history of being involved in partisan politics, my co-author, Amber, is fiercely independent. She ran Denver elections for 15 years, and she was really the architect of a lot of the voting reforms that have happened across the country. And she, along with Secretaries Benson and Wyman, who we interviewed, feel very strongly that politics should not play any role in election administration. And he's very, very, very firm to that. And so I think what you'll find if you read the book is that you will see that we call out both political parties. And we are more focused on engaging in infrastructure change and changes to systems. And like I said before, getting involved with nonpartisan groups like the National Vote at Home Institute that are expert witnesses in cases and testifying and getting accurate information out there and facts, so that the issues that are close to our heart cannot be politicized. But at this point in time, with 3 weeks before Election Day, I would say no matter who you support politically or what issues you support, the most important thing that you can do is vote. And our mantra in our book, if you go to our website, we say focus on who votes, not who wins. And that is the most important thing. So I wish you all a happy election season. I know we're all ready for it to be over. And then I think no matter what the outcome is, it will be important for us to roll up our sleeves and get to work. We have one more. Let's see here. What do you suggest when all inputs for medicine are being curtailed? Dr. Gold from UCLA, a physician and attorney, has been eloquent but removed from information, along with Robert Kennedy Jr. and Dr. Buttar. How do we overcome the tolerance for editing that appears to be increasing? This is everywhere. And this is because the flow of information has been democratized in many ways. You don't have to, you can have platforms if you're a publisher of content to get your information out that doesn't require editing and fact checking and or anything like that. Whether it's Medium, Facebook, or Twitter, which is a popular one. And I think what has to happen again is more focus on groups uniting, coming together to actually get appropriate facts out and to tell the truth. So I don't have a great answer for you, Renee, but I can say that I think there's an increasing intolerance for exactly what you are, what you're talking about. Sometimes it requires just writing a counter.
So thank you, Stephanie, so much for helping us find our voice. We look forward to your work in the future, and maybe we'll get together again soon.
It would be great. Thank you all for everything that you do. And my husband suggested I start off with saying that my daughter was allergic to math, and we were going to change that. But I thought that was a bad joke, so I'm glad I didn't. But I appreciate everything that you do. So take good care, and here's to restoring democracy.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Take care.
Night.
Night.